Hello, everyone. We are live. I'm Kellyanne. I'm a bookseller at Mysterious Galaxy, and tonight I am so excited to be able to introduce the authors that we are hosting for tonight's virtual event. We've got molecular biologist turned Anthony Award-winning author Chris Holm with us. We're celebrating his newest novel, Child Zero, which is a fact-based sci-fi thriller about our species' next great existential threat. We also have with us Nick Petrie, our conversation partner and moderator for the evening. He's the author of the best-selling Peter Ash novels. If you haven't joined us before for one of our virtual events on Crowdcast, on the right-hand side, you'll find our chat section. Please feel free to write any comments you have as the event goes on. Say hi to our authors there. And below our video, you'll see a green button that says Buy Books with Signed Book Plates. That'll take you to Mysterious Galaxy's website, where you can purchase a copy of Child Zero, and it will come with a signed book plate from Chris, if you haven't done that already. And then last but not least, below that, you'll find a button that says Ask a Question. If you click that, you can type any question you'd like for both of our authors. They will answer them in the second half of the event. And with that, I'm going to turn my screen off and let the event get started, and I'll see you guys at the end. Have a great event.
Thanks, Kellyanne. Hi, Chris. Nice to see you, even if it's virtual.
It's great to see you. How you doing, buddy?
I'm all right. I'm doing good. I'm, it's a little later in Milwaukee and later still in Maine, where you are.
It is. I tried when I was recruiting somebody for this event to think about somebody in an earlier time zone than me at the very least.
Yeah,
I don't want to speak for you, but I'm a very old man, so doing this at 10 p.m. is a whole other ball game.
I've had 4 Red Bulls in the last 5 minutes, so I'm ready to go. All ready to go.
I just had a glass of wine and watched Barry, so I'm very confused about what's going on right now. I was settling in for a nice evening and then popped upstairs to do an event. So,
there you go.
Thank you guys, by the way, everybody who's tuning in, because this is remarkable. It's fun for me to get to do something on the West Coast for a change, being all the way on the other side of the map. So this is a kick.
Well, and we know you have plenty of other things to do there, you folks in the audience. So we appreciate your taking time out of your life to spend it with us.
Absolutely.
So Kellyanne missed a couple of superlatives, I've noticed, Chris. That some of your earlier work has been New York Times Editor's Choice, Boston Globe Best Book of the Year, different books, by the way. And you've had a story in the Best American Mystery Stories as well, which is no small feat, I got to say. And I noticed somebody is commenting on our plaid shirts. I really, we should have done a little more coordination.
I know it is a little bit funny. I feel like we could each be the other's body double. Although I have to say, we met years ago now. It must have been right around the time your first book was coming out, so like 2016 or so. And you don't look any different, but I look like I've aged. Like, how presidents come in and then they come out 20 years older looking. I feel like that's what's happened to me in the ensuing 6 years. Well, I think this book is to blame, honestly.
Well, the thing that one of the reasons why I lobbied hard to do this is that you and Katrina were among the first people that I really met in the mystery community. And you guys were and it was at that Murder and Mayhem event in Milwaukee, and you and Katrina both were just so sort of kind and generous with your time and supportive, and you and I haven't gotten to see each other a whole lot in the ensuing years, but that's always meant a lot to me. And
Thank you so much.
I think of you guys as both really great ambassadors for this community, which is a really sort of warm and welcoming place. So thank you for that.
Oh gosh, thank you so much. That's kind of you to say.
So about this book that you've written, which I gotta say I had so much fun reading it. Not just the first time. The first time, as a writer, I like to read things a couple of times, and the first time is just like everybody else. I read for like what's going to happen next, and there's lots and lots of that in this book. There are twists and turns and big ideas. But reading it the second time, I really got a sense of sort of the craftsmanship involved. And it just, again, kind of a whole new level of appreciation for what you do. But so we really should start with the premise of this book, which is a world where antibiotics no longer work. So talk to me about that, the premise itself, and kind of where that idea came from for you.
Sure. So so the book is, I consider it sort of a fact-based thriller in the vein of Michael Crichton. It takes place in a world reeling from the collapse of the antibiotic era. And that said, it's not strictly speaking a pandemic book. It's not specifically about this pandemic. It's sort of a breakneck chase-style thriller where the pandemic is its backdrop. It centers on a young boy named Mateo, who is the sole survivor of an attack on Central Park, or of an attack on a shanty town in Central Park, and then the two detectives, Jake and Amy, who are tasked with investigating the crime. The premise came from the fact that in my day job for a long time, while I was writing books, I was a molecular biologist, and for a lot of years, scientists and public health officials have been really sounding the alarm bells about this very collapse of the antibiotic era. But by and large, the public has been unmoved by those warnings. And I kind of thought that, well, I think the problem is the fault of the scientists to some extent, because we're not doing a great job of explaining to people why this is so scary. I think most people, when they hear about antibiotic resistance, they might picture like, MRSA staph infections that don't respond to treatment, but they don't necessarily understand how far those ripples are going to go. And I thought, well, as somebody who writes thrillers for a living, who has a science background, I was in a unique position to translate that and put something on the page to show people just how scary that post-antibiotic world is going to be. And apparently I succeeded, because everybody who reads the book tells me it's terrifying. So I guess that's a positive, I suppose.
It's funny because I didn't find it terrifying. I found it. I mean, you're talking about the pandemic. I was a little concerned when I realized that this book was sort of going to be coming out sort of in the shadow of COVID-19, and I wondered how that would play. But to me, that's the resonance of it is really kind of amazing. And so it doesn't terrify me. It sort of opened a window. It's a sort of a different view of what we're going through right now. Mm-hmm. That to me, that's kind of how it feels, more than, although there were some skin crawling moments, I have to say. But
yeah. Well, if you're writing a biological thriller, you have to kind of walk right up to the line a time or two just to get the point across.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't think it's not like Cronenbergian body horror from start to finish or anything like that. It really is just a story that takes place with this pandemic as its backdrop. And similarly, I think it's interesting. I've heard people describe it as dystopian, as post-apocalyptic, and I don't see it as either of those things. First of all, I think it's too plausible to be dystopian, or maybe we're already living through a dystopian reality. I'm not sure. And then secondly, as far as post-apocalyptic, I don't see it as an apocalypse. I mean, people still have jobs. They pay rent. They go to work. I reference a soccer camp that early on in the book. I feel like there aren't soccer camps in the apocalypse. So it's interesting because I wanted to sort of add my voice to the people who were sounding the alarm, but I didn't want to write it in an alarmist way. I wanted it to be as factual as possible and as true to what the scientific community is predicting as possible. That was important to me.
So dive into that science piece just a little bit here. You're a molecular biologist. This is definitely part of your sort of professional skill set and your area of interest for a long time. So kind of give us sort of the science for idiots, please.
Sure.
Which you actually do a really good job of in the book.
Thank you. And it's interesting because I am aware that people will I tried to write it such that people will take as much or as little of the science as they need. The crux of the book is that for about a decade or two, scientists have really, really been trying to say, hey guys, we need to deal with this antibiotic issue. There have been a lot of misconceptions over the years. And I think one of the things I always think about is we tend to see the world that we live in as inherently stable. When, as it turns out, a lot of people, myself included, who grew up in the antibiotic era, grew up in this incredibly rare time historically, where we had these tools at our disposal that no one before and possibly no one after will have. So here's the gist of it. Penicillin was introduced in 1941. By 1942, doctors started seeing penicillin-resistant microbes, right? Infections that just wouldn't respond to penicillin. And at the time, and I bet you've heard this, I heard this growing up, doctors would say, oh, that's just because patients failed to take their full cycle. The idea was you knock back most of the infection, you stop taking it, and then what comes surging back is sort of resistant because it managed to survive. It's sort of like an artificial spin on natural selection. But what's really weird is by the 1950s, doctors started seeing microbes that were resistant to drugs that patient had never taken. And that led them to some really peculiar discoveries. What they started to realize was, so there's actually a bunch of different ways in which bacteria are able to exchange genetic material. And this is what I meant by you can take as much or as little of the science as you want, because really I tried to lay out the case for how this scientifically happens, but what you need to understand is we're headed toward a reality in which antibiotics don't work. And it's not just that the old antibiotics won't work. We're heading toward a reality in which any new antibiotic might easily become overrun in record time. And the reason is because bacteria, like humans, are susceptible to viruses. Their viruses are called bacteriophages. They're gnarly looking things. If you Google bacteriophage, you'll see this crazy little lunar lander type thing. And it lands on a bacteria and it injects its genetic information just like viruses would for us. But the weird thing about their viruses is they have this funny habit of taking DNA from one of the bacterium that they attach to, pulling it out and injecting it into another one. It's kind of like how bees cross-pollinate flowers, right? And it's because bacteria divide to breed, so they make identical copies of themselves. So this is a little weird evolutionary way for them to evolve quickly. And it's through this method that any bacterium that bumps into an antibiotic and survives can teach every other bacteria on the planet to do the same, which is really wild. It's hard to wrap your head around, but it's actually so crazy that there are now scientists who think it might be worthwhile to start thinking about the entire, every bacterium on the planet as like a giant superorganism that's capable of communicating across great distances and spreading genetic information. It's some really wild, heady stuff. But the gist of it is, if a bacteriophage that was really good at that cross-pollination kind of broke loose, we could be inundated with bacteria that are resistant to anything we throw at them because they can adapt with alarming speed. It's some really scary stuff.
Well, and that's a piece of this book, right? Is you've given us sort of this perfect storm. So it's not just sort of the antibiotic resistance that we're seeing now. You've also given us that microbe that has sort of metastasized that resistance across sort of the whole spectrum.
Yeah, but
that's a man-made thing, right? In your book, this comes from climate change has thawed this new microbe from the Arctic, and that's what's done this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's not man-made in the sense that this is not like a bioengineered virus. These sorts of viruses do exist in nature. So actually, it wouldn't even be a new virus. It'd be a very old virus that's trapped in the permafrost, gets loose and wreaks all kinds of havoc. But that's not a plot device. They actually exist. In fact, I have a bibliography in the book. In one of the citations is for a super spreader that was discovered a couple of years ago that is exactly the sort of virus that I'm warning against. And what's crazy about these viruses, I mean, chances are most people who are listening to this right now have never heard the word bacteriophage, and yet they are the most common biological entities on Earth. They outnumber insects, they outnumber bacteria, they outnumber other kinds of viruses. They're everywhere. They blanket the Earth. So it's not that much a stretch, especially when you think about the crazy amounts of antibiotics that we pump into the water supply. 90% of the antibiotics we make on this planet go straight into livestock production, just to keep up with food demand. And so not only is that wildly unregulated in terms of the way it's used globally, particularly in emerging nations, but it leads to an unsustainable amount of food production in the long term that could crash horribly if this future comes to pass.
That's one of the consequences that are occurring in this book is really the crash of the food system. So give us a list of sort of the societal consequences here.
Sure. So for one thing, diseases that are long thought beaten will come surging back. Tuberculosis is an obvious one. So is pneumonia, which was the #1 killer in the United States before antibiotics, and now is knocked way down the list. But that'll come surging back in a big way. Organ transplants will no longer be possible. Neither will implants of any kind, hip, knee, cosmetic. As I mentioned, you're going to see dramatic amounts of food scarcity, which is a huge issue. It'll impact fruit production as well. Not so much vegetable production, which is, I suppose, a positive. You're going to start seeing an omnipresent threat of bioterror, in fact, because right now, when the United States government wants to do computer modeling of bioterror, they tend to use the model organism Y. pestis, which is responsible for bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague. Literally like the Black Death plague. And what's crazy about that is the reason they choose that as a model organism is because it's very easy to grow. It's very common. You can find it in most of the rodents on the planet, and it can be deadly. Specifically, pneumonic plague, which appears in the book, does not require an animal vector. It can be aerosolized, and without access to functional antibiotics, it is literally 100% fatal. It will. Anyone who gets infected with it will be dead within a week without antibiotics. And so that's really chilling. And this isn't just, this is, the WHO has been warning about this. They actually said that far from being an apocalyptic fantasy, this post-antibiotic future is a very real possibility for the 21st century. The CDC director in 2019 said, we need to stop talking about the coming post-antibiotic era. It's already here. And in 2021, at the height of COVID, Science ran an op-ed piece by 2 physicians saying, and this, scientists are not prone to hyperbole. So when they say things like, unless we get new therapies into the pipeline, the decimation of modern medicine is imminent. That shit scares the crap out of me. And, the UN estimates that directly from these multi-drug resistant organisms, we'll see by 2050 about 10 million deaths per year. Up from about 100,000 a year right now. And that doesn't count any of the food scarcity issues, the bioterror issues, anything like that. It's some really, really scary stuff. And you're talking about, a paper cut could kill you.
Right.
Does make for kind of a chilling world. I promise the book isn't all doom and gloom. It's actually very
I feel like we should segue away from the imminent demise of our society.
Yes, imminent demise of our species. Yeah, that's.
So one of the things that, and this is sort of a segue, one of the things I really like about this book, it's such a great showcase for your skills as a writer, the world building that you do is so, and world building for those who aren't, it's a term of art, which is really how a writer introduces the reader sort of element by element to the world that the characters are living in. And we might think of this as sort of a sci-fi fantasy thing, but it's something that every writer does, right? If this is a cozy mystery set in the English countryside, it's got to be a certain kind of, you have to set the stage for that. You have to show us that world. And I noticed this especially in your settings. I love these New York City locations that they're really richly drawn, and they give you this vision, and it does feel sort of like a fallen city. It's sort of like a 70s version of New York. There's the detention camp in the middle of Central Park. There's an apartment building turned into a squat by the crypto anarchist collective. There's an illicit marketplace housed in a subway station where service has stopped. And you're both giving us this very vivid scene, and it's also a location for some great set pieces as well that you're doing. So talk about sort of how you think about setting, how you came up with these elements in particular.
I love that you mentioned 1970s New York, because I do think late 70s, early 80s New York holds such a fascination for me, because it was this really gritty period for the city, but it also was a really vibrant era for the city. I mean, you think about the art that was coming out of New York in the 70s, the punk movement, the hip hop movement. You had Basquiat, and sort of graffiti being elevated to high art. So there was this grit, but there was also a glamour to it, which I really enjoyed. When I think of setting, I think in terms of, I love writing action. So I love creating interesting set pieces. I'm worried we might have lost Nick here. He might be frozen.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Good.
All right.
Okay, so you're frozen, but you're still coming through. Okay.
I'm all right.
I just thought you were really into my answer.
I'm deeply focused. Yes.
No. So I always love. I want to create a setting with specificity. I want to create a setting that I feel like maybe I haven't seen before, or at least a spin on something. You mentioned the market. It's actually in the I believe 191st Street station, which is the deepest in the New York subway system. That station has been closed, and so because there are no cell signals down there, it becomes this sort of almost Victorian bazaar for any weird thing that you can't get on the surface. People go and check it out, and that was very intentional, because I think when you think of sort of a pre-antibiotic era, there's this idea of, I think of, the tubercular people coughing into their kerchiefs in Victorian England and stuff. And so I wanted to bring a little of that in and have some fun with that. I wanted to take some of the beauty of New York and kind of introduce some grit. There's a pedestrian pier that I feature that's sort of been overrun. And it's just because I thought it was a pretty setting, and it was someplace fun that I wanted to write. In terms of the squat, that was very much trying to draw from that gritty, like 70s, like you picture the fires in the old oil barrels, and so that for me is a lot of fun. But I wanted to write with as much specificity and as much accuracy as possible about the city, because I knew, well, when I started writing the book, COVID hadn't happened, and so I felt like I was going to have to sell people on the plausibility. And so I needed the book to be as grounded as possible so that people would buy the premise. So I didn't want to get too fanciful. I really wanted to set it in the real world as much as possible and show people the New York they're familiar with kind of turned 45 degrees.
Right. Right. Well, you're obviously having a bunch of fun with this book. There are a couple of things that I love. I love the crypto anarchist collective, who are basically squatters and meth addicts.
Yeah, right. So they call themselves a crypto anarchist collective, but really they're just cooking meth and running malware scams. I mean, they're just dirt bags who. But I kind of like the point of view character who sort of introduces them as a crypto anarchist collective. He really does kind of feel like they're out there, fighting the good fight in their own weird way.
They're on the bleeding edge. Well, even the crazy people think they're sane, right? I mean,
exactly. And I like writing characters that, nobody's the villain in their own story. And I like a mustache twirling villain as much as the next guy. But I also really like characters who are utterly mistakenly convinced they're on the right side.
Well, and the mustache twirling is entertaining, but I think like a villain that you can be sympathetic to is much more, to me, is a more powerful villain, because you kind of fall for their shtick too a little bit.
Sure.
If you can, and that's what I loved about it. There's another piece that you've done, the Soldiers of Gaia. Is this social movement, and they consider themselves environmentalists committed to ending human domination of the planet. But of course, that's not really what they are.
No, they're kind of a nihilistic death cult.
Right.
Yeah, and what's funny is, I knew those guys growing up in a weird way. They were based on people that I sort of glanced off of in my teenage years, because I grew up in Syracuse, New York, a giant music geek, and the only scene that Syracuse had in the '90s that was worth a damn was the hardcore punk scene. And Syracuse's brand of hardcore punk was militantly vegan and straight edge, and so I knew guys who, I mean, were advocating violence against meat eaters and looking to sabotage meat packing plants and stuff like that. I remember a buddy dragged me to a record release party for a band that's reasonably well known now called Earth Crisis. It was for this album All Out War, and I remember they had these lyrics that were like, "Violence against violence, let the roundups begin," and I was like, I think I'm in a really sketchy room right now. And I found it fascinating. In fact, I name dropped one of the bands from that sort of scene, Vegan Reich, which I think tells you all you need to know about their militants. And there's a great random fact about them, which is a couple of the members of Vegan Reich tried to establish a utopian vegan community in Hawaii. But it crumbled in a matter of weeks because they couldn't agree on basic things like whether they supported sex outside marriage, whether they should eat vegetables or only fruits, because vegetables you kill, but fruits fall from trees, whether cooking those fruits was immoral. And like, I just love, I love the insane purity one-upsmanship that comes from a subculture like that. And so I kind of baked it into this book, where these people, they are legitimately dangerous. They are very scary. They are a threat, but they're also ridiculous. And I think what I kind of had in mind there was on a grander scale of what Elmore Leonard always loved to do. It's one of my favorite things about his books. He often has a good guy and then a couple of different bad guys. And one bad guy's an old pro. He knows what he's doing. He's got a code, And then the other guy is like the young buck who pretty much just came up, swallowing the myth whole, thinks he's a badass gangster, and he's actually usually the most dangerous one because he's completely unhinged. That's what I wanted to do. I had in the book sort of the big, intimidating, militaristic bad guys. I wanted to have something that was the flip side of that coin. They were they were not disciplined. They were absolutely bonkers out of their heads, but nonetheless, they are a legitimate threat. That was a lot of fun for me to write. It was it's always more fun to pile in extra bad guys, and
Right.
They were particularly, I feel bad saying it, but like joyous to write, just because they were so ludicrous. It was almost action as comedy.
Well, and they were sort of, I don't know if I'm frozen again. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank
All
you.
right. Yeah, there was sort of this kind of bro-y thing that they were doing.
Yeah, and that was not by accident, because I think this scene that I was sort of tangentially a part of espoused things like being a big tent or supporting diversity, but it was a bunch of angry white boys. That's literally what it was. And if there were a few girls in the scene, and I say girls as opposed to women, because this was mostly, tweens and teenagers going to these all ages shows, and on a Sunday matinee, like 10 bands for $5 sort of thing. And for me, it was good fun. jump in the mosh pit, you jump off the stage, you listen to some really shitty bands, and you get some aggression out. But I think that for me was a privilege. If I were a young woman going there and I were stage diving, I'd end up groped, I'd end up harassed. It was not a welcoming scene. And what amazed me about it was how conservative it ended up skewing, because, you know, it was this vegan straight edge scene ended up, not to start talking about some very hot button issues right now, but ended up very anti-choice, because somewhere along the line they got their wires crossed between animal liberation and the protection of innocent fetuses, I suppose. It started out as a punk movement and ended up sounding an awful lot like, you know, like an arch conservative evangelical Christian movement. And so I found that dichotomy fascinating, and that's what I wanted to write those guys as, is just like they took a good idea, which is limiting humankind's impact on the planet, and turned it into a really bad one, which was, let's do that by murdering people, which seems like a bad idea.
Seems like a bad idea.
Seems like a bad idea. It's a little extreme.
I think that would be an interesting.
By the way, the real star of the show just showed up. She was sniffing around. This is Moxie.
Oh, hey, Moxie.
Dashiell is around here somewhere too.
Yeah. I think that would be a really interesting book to write, is to sort of the inside view of a culture like that devolving.
Well, and I think, you know, I obviously saw some parallels too to groups like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys. You know, I think you know, to have a modicum of sympathy for the devil, it's an awful lot of people who feel like they don't belong anywhere else, getting together and creating their own society with its own rules. And what I'm fascinated by, and you see this with all kinds of movements, you saw it with sort of the hippie movement, you saw it with the punk movement. Everybody who tries to rip it up and start again basically reinvents the same exact societal strictures. You know, we repeat our mistakes. And so these guys, yeah, they just fell sway to a charismatic guy who, you know, led them down this path. And I often think we see this in society today. Just because they're cosplaying at being these thugs doesn't mean they're not dangerous, you know?
Yeah, I think we've seen that in the present day.
Yeah, a little too much. We've seen altogether too much of that. And that was something I was very cognizant of putting on the page on purpose. I feel like if you want to, as you said, world building, if you want to look at the ramifications of something like the collapse of the antibiotic era, it's not enough to just look at the science. You have to look at what that's going to do for things like, if there's food scarcity, if we're afraid of people bringing diseases in, we're going to have a spike in nationalism. You know, if we're mistrustful of our fellow man, you get these violent factions. You know, it's those ripple effects are a lot of fun to explore from a world building point of view, and hopefully, you know, help flesh out that world in a way that people recognize, but from enough of a remove that they can still enjoy the story. Well,
and I think that's part of what makes this book such a rich experience, is that you've really thought deeply about the, you know, the basic premise, the ramifications of that, and then the ramifications of the ramifications. And it's not, and again, it's so smooth, it's so liquid. Again, I just was really impressed with just the way that you layered things in. There was never a moment where I thought, boy, he's certainly explaining something now. You know, and it's really a rare thing to as a writer to read a book and to say and to not notice the necessary bits. So it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. That means a lot, because I knew going in, I was asking people to swallow some fairly heady scientific stuff at the outset, just to set the world into motion. And so I kind of consider it as like a heaping spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down, that the book is very pacey.
Yeah.
It moves like a rocket. It's intentionally lean. I probably wrote twice as many words as are actually contained in the book, and just teared ruthlessly until I had a really taut story. And for me, you know, the watchword was sort of, what would Michael Crichton do? He has fallen a bit out of favor in the past decade or two, because he tilted towards some slightly out there views at the end of his life. But man, there was nobody who could get across complex concepts more breezily than Crichton. And I think whether it's the Andromeda Strain, which was a master class in microbiology, or Jurassic Park, which was a genetics class masquerading as an adventure story about dinosaurs.
Right, which revolutionized our culture, right? I mean, it suddenly it rebooted dinosaurs. Yeah.
And just as a science geek myself, I mean, the guy took something that I thought was cool, that everybody else thought was lame, and used it to bring back dinosaurs. That's amazing. We can quibble about where he fudged it here and there to make it work, but dinosaurs. Who cares?
Dinosaurs, right?
Dinosaurs.
Well, so that I want to kind of do one last topic here before we go to questions, because we do have a few questions here. So now you've mentioned a couple of times that this book took you 6 years to write.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote in a blog post that it was a premise in search of a story, and that's part of why it took so long. But I've always thought of you as a high concept writer, between The Collector and I'm spacing on his name, the Hitman for Hitmen.
Hendricks, yes.
Hendricks, yeah. I mean, those are high concept books. So what was different about this?
They were high concept books, but they both started with a character. They started with a scene that was playing in my head from a character's perspective. And I was able to, in both cases, it was actually sort of the opening of The Killing Kind, the opening of Dead Harvest. I had those scenes playing through my head one night as I was drifting off to sleep. And so I was able to, jot down everything I could remember about them and interrogate those scenes to figure out who these characters were. And in this case, really what I had was the idea that I wanted to write a thriller that took place in a post-antibiotic world.
And it could have taken place in a lab. It could have taken place in, I mean, at the WHO. It could have I mean, you could have started, at 30,000 feet. You could, I mean, this is really ground level as it gets.
Yeah, and that was one of the goals I set for myself. I didn't want to have any lectures take place. Nobody standing behind a lectern explaining things. I didn't want to have just a bunch of talking heads in lab coats while the world goes awry outside. I wanted it to be ground level, real people who are recognizable to the reader experiencing this world. And that was important to me. Obviously, the research was a big deal for me, because I am a scientist. And this was the first time I'd really incorporated science in a major way in any of my work. And I was determined not to cut a single corner as far as the science. And so that added some difficulty as well. But also, and by the way, I should note, as I mentioned, I think we met in about 2016. You have since put out, that was around your first book, around The Drifter. So you now have 7 books, most recent being The Runaway, yes? All of those came out while I was either working on this book or waiting for it to be published. So I feel like I've really been slacking.
I mean, the reason I'm interested in this is because I have had books that really, I've had moments where long chunks where I've been really struggling with a book, or feeling like maybe it was time to go do something else. Or, I mean, the writing novels is not for the faint of heart, and there is not a lot of encouragement from the outside world. Most of the time, it's you by yourself in a room, trying to figure something out. And so I am super sympathetic to the challenges of this process. So was there something that you feel like you learned something in the process?
So I learned a number of things. And I'm going to get very, very blunt and honest about this. So I think a big part of why it took so long was a crisis of confidence. I felt like to the outside world I was riding high. The Killing Kind did quite well, critically and commercially. My cats are now trying to knock over my computer. And Red Right Hand, the follow-up, actually got more starred reviews than The Killing Kind did. It got some terrific reviews. It was nominated for some stuff, but it didn't really catch on quite as well with readers. And I remember being very frustrated because I felt like I tried to come up with something high concept that might capture the public consciousness with Michael Hendricks. And I didn't do a bad job at it. He certainly got his fans, and I'm not saying I'm done writing him, but I wanted to take a swing that would maybe get me to the next level. Unfortunately, I wanted to do it at a time when my confidence in my abilities was just not at an all-time high. I was beginning to doubt myself, and that, as you said, it's just you and the page. So if you're second guessing everything, you're in some trouble. It took me forever to get words down for the longest time, to the extent where, I very much thought about trying other things.
Well, especially because the process is entirely different from how you've done it before. So that you've just added this other giant obstacle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, I used to say that writing is my therapy. I think a lot of writers feel that way, that they like to get words down on the page because it helps them process the world. But I've stopped saying that because, as it turns out, therapy is my therapy, and writing is just what I do for a living. It took 40 some years to get to that point. But I genuinely, I struggled so much with this book that I sought psychiatric help for the first time in my life. And it turns out I've been walking around with undiagnosed anxiety and depression for an awfully long time. And I have a feeling I'm not alone in that manifesting as writer's block. I mean, anxiety and depression, you're like, what if I suck? It doesn't matter anyways, nobody cares. It's not a great way to go into writing a book.
Right.
So what I learned was how to recognize when my brain is lying to me, and also when I need to maybe back up and get some perspective. So I really, I kind of had to rebuild from the ground up to figure out how to write this book, which was ultimately very healthy for me. But it wasn't a fun process, I will say that. Ultimately, I had a lot of fun writing the book once I wrapped my head around it. But when I say it took maybe 5 years to write a draft, probably the first 2 of those years were virtually useless. I got an awful lot of terrible writing out of it. And by the way, I still think that writing's terrible. I've looked at some of those early abortive chapters, and it was bad because it was so hesitant. It was bad because I had no idea what I wanted to say or how to say it, and I just kept second guessing.
Well, it goes back to that confidence thing, right? You have to have the internal confidence that you have this thing that's worth telling, and then you also have to have the confidence on the page itself. You have to be, brash and bold and declarative, and trust that the reader will follow you. And for me, the problem is always when, I am not trusting my own ability to write a decent sentence, let alone set a scene that someone's going to want to read. I mean, and again, I've had conversations like this with so many writers, and I have. This is something that I've struggled with forever, and I have, we both, I think, have friends who write a book or two every year, and I'm, I just threw out 5 months worth of work on a book, which was quite painful.
And well, I'm sorry to hear that, but I will say, the good news is nobody can tell which ones were struggling and which ones weren't.
Right.
I think, I'm getting some of the best responses of my career with this one. And it was a joyless slog for 3 of the 5 years, probably. And I always think back to Lou Berney, whose November Road, I remember when he was writing it, he really struggled, and he scrapped a lot, and sort of, took a couple of different swings at it, and kind of had to cobble together his first draft out of a couple of different abortive ones. And it's a beautiful novel, a beautiful award-winning novel.
Right.
So I find it reassuring that all that effort is not wasted. But it never comforts me in the moment when I realize that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Part of the problem, I think, is when you really step into this is a little bit in the weeds for readers maybe, but when you become a writer who earns his living as a writer, it changes, and you have to find a way to come to terms with that evolution of,
Yeah.
writing is this thing that you do for pleasure to writing is this thing that you also do for a living. And it's easy to lose the pleasure, and I think that's a struggle I've heard a lot of people talk about.
Yeah, and I also think, and this sounds like such a ridiculous humble brag of a complaint, but I think a lot of writers, I imagine it's the same for a lot of performers, stand-up comedians, things like that. We do this for a variety of reasons, but obviously we all crave validation in some respect. And I think you have this idea that when I get published, like everything is going to be gravy, or when I win that award, it's going to be great, or we always set these external goals for, man, when I hit that, everything is going to be right in the world. And to some extent, I ended up, I ended up with my dream publisher. I had a book that won a major literary award. I was getting to travel all around the country, to book events and stuff and meeting these terrific people. And I still didn't feel great.
Yeah.
It was like, well, if that didn't fix me, what's going to? So I think pinning all your hopes on that is a really unhealthy thing. And I really had to relearn how to write for the joy of it. I'm not sure joy is the right word. Joy is not the right word. It's rarely joyous for my own satisfaction, as opposed to try and hit some external metric.
Right. No, I think that's important. So I don't know. I could talk with you about this topic alone for a couple of hours, and I think I don't know if you're going to be at Thriller Fest or if we have to wait till BoucherCon. But I
think we're going to have to wait till BoucherCon. But sometime we should just do like the writer's block thing. I have a feeling we'd have a lot of anonymous lurkers in the in the chat. But I think it'd be informative. And I know some terrific writers who've struggled with it. By the way, if you're watching this and you're shaking your head and thinking that writer's block does not exist, you are wrong. And
Shame on you.
And I sincerely hope you never find out how wrong you are, because I used to be one of those assholes who is just like, writer's block is just, it's nothing. Well, it turns out it's not nothing. It can be crippling, and it's a challenge. But
well, it's sort of an occupational hazard.
Of course.
For this.
And I think it's a sign that you care about what you're putting on the page.
Right.
Probably to an unhealthy degree.
Well, yeah, maybe so. I mean, I know lots of visual artists as well, and so I mean, it's painters and sculptors, and I mean, this is a universal in the creative world. Is that sometimes the work doesn't want to, something's getting in the way. So anyway, well, I appreciate your your willingness to talk about this. I think it helps other people.
I hope so. I feel like I'm a bit of a lunkhead when it comes to stuff like that. Like, most people who grew up in working class, families, like, the idea of talking to a shrink or something, or God forbid, getting medicated for anything is anathema. So I feel like I'm now like a poster child for that, where I'm like, you know what, guys, it actually does get better. As somebody just said in the chat, mental health matters. And I used to think, yeah, mental health matters for other people. I mean, I'm fine.
Yeah, we're all just fine.
I'm fine, but for other people, sure.
Boy, I feel sorry for all those other people.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
All
right. Well, one of the not to devalue this piece of the conversation, but we do have a mandate to get to some questions here.
Of course.
So the first question is, when writing about this, how did you keep from doom spiraling about the fate of humanity? Was that something that was a concern for you with a topic like this?
So here's the funny thing. I don't think this book is as scary as other people do. I actually think this book is pretty hopeful. my background, I originally after college thought I was going to be a bug hunter for the CDC. I wanted to be one of those people who went into, you know, hot zones and investigated the root cause of like novel hemorrhagic fevers and the like. That was what I wanted to do. I was serious enough about it. I enrolled in a PhD program at the University of Virginia School of Medicine in microbiology. We used to go over slides from the CDC's morbidity and mortality weekly report. It was a Friday lunch meeting. We would order pizza, go over these horrifying slides. So,
pizza with red sauce.
Yeah, exactly. Which is to say that I think, you know, it takes a certain sort to find that interesting and to even, you know, find the elegance in a disease that does what it does very, very well. You know, COVID's an excellent example. It is just, it's a remarkable disease, which is why it tore across the globe. I mean, it's got everything you would want if you were a disease trying to take over the globe. It reproduces quickly. It has a long latency period. It can be spread by asymptomatic carriers. So my point is, if I didn't doom spiral when I was actually in that world, visiting it, you know, kind of vacationing in it from 9 to 5 while I was writing this book wasn't going to do it. I have always known that was a possibility. So it's not like it's something I discovered while I was writing this book. That said, where I often do struggle isn't with the public health stuff, because even though I have a healthy mistrust of institutions, I do trust decent, smart people will do the right thing. And I truly believe that the future that I am portraying can be averted. That's part of the reason I wrote the book. We're in an age of medical miracles right now. Because of, for example, RNA vaccines, we saw 3 vaccines, 2 of them excellent, both of the RNA vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer, within 11 months of the causative agent of COVID being identified. Before that, mumps was the quickest vaccine ever produced, and it took 4 years. You know, and it should be noted too, the reason we were able to make those as quickly as we could is because a Chinese scientist disobeyed his government and uploaded the entirety of the COVID sequence online for everyone to access. And within a week, Pfizer had designed their target for their vaccine. Where I avoid, you know, falling into a doom spiral is realizing we got some smart people on the case. We can fix this. We can do this. So conversely, where I do doom spiral is when shit like Buffalo happens, and I'm forced to acknowledge that there are these people like my soldiers of Gaia, like my end timers, you know, that kind of are the flip side of that coin.
That are actively lobbying for the end of the world.
Yeah, so, you know, I just have to focus on our better angels prevailing. Yeah. And I apologize for running over, because I know we've got a ton of questions to get to. But
no. Well, I think you've answered a couple of those actually. There's a question here about writing in another type of genre, which I think is hilarious when it comes to you, because I feel like so your first trilogy are the collector books, which is basically a guy who is his job is to collect souls of the damned to deliver to I couldn't remember, so I have to write it down. The man downstairs is how you refer to the devil, which is just so wonderful. Then you wrote 2 high concept thrillers, The Killing Kind and Red Right Hand, about a hitman who targets other hitmen. And now you've basically written Michael Crichton meets Stephen King. I think to me the Stephen King piece is the sort of that street level, deep into humanity piece that he does so well. So you know, are you still mixing it up? Is there something else you want to do? Are you going to do, you know, sort of something else in the Child Zero world? Kind of what are you working on now?
So I'm working on a few different standalone ideas right now, none of which are in this world. I'm just creatively restless. I don't like to repeat myself. Even within the collector books, I had like different themes for each book. I had one that dealt with like kind of my take on the Universal movie monsters. I had one that was, I consider my Shane Black buddy comedy meets Lovecraft. The first one was just straight up, pulp noir, kind of emulating the classic pulps. Yeah, I just don't think I'm smart enough to create a brand and stick to it. Is really what it boils down to.
Well,
I want to write a little bit of everything. I read everything, so
right.
I don't see why I should. Speaking of Crichton, not for nothing, but he started out writing pulps under various names, which you can now find many of them from Hard Case Crime. But he also had like the Great Train Robbery. He did microbiological stuff. He did dinosaurs. He did alien artifacts.
Time travel.
Yeah. So what I love is like he just wrote whatever the hell he wanted and trusted that his audience would follow along. If you were to ask me what makes a Chris Holm book, I have no idea. But presumably something links them. I actually think that the main character of my other two series, the main characters are very similar. They're both seeking redemption and not quite sure what it means. It's just one's a hitman and one's, I guess, kind of a Grim Reaper. So I don't know.
Which again, those aren't that different, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. So I'm not sure how it all fits together, but I also think I was just looking into. I did a list recently of great biological thrillers, and The Boys from Brazil was on the list. And what was the guy's name? Ira Levin. I mean, he also wrote. I mean, he wrote some crazy he wrote noir, he wrote horror, he wrote science fiction. He wrote like 8 books in his lifetime, and no 2 were in the same genre, which is wild to me. Yeah, I don't know. I just do it to entertain myself, I guess.
Well, I think that's the way to go, right? I mean, the classic advice is write the book you want to read. So, kind of what are you reading what floats your boat at the moment?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I write this series, but each of the books are so distinct from each other. I mean, to me, that's part of the fun is to. I mean, again, sort of the publishing line about writing series is the same but different. And I feel like mine are more different than they are the same.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say.
The characters are there, but I have books that are about technology. The latest one is a very, very small, kind of intense psychological story. I wrote a book set in Iceland that was that was the one that I was really suffering on, and that is about sort of guilt and depression, and I think that is part of what all writers do. I just think it's sort of a luxury, and I admire that you really have been reaching for these different disparate things.
The funny thing is, I love long-standing series. I love that character who's an old friend. I mean, that's what Peter Ash is so great. I mean, you get to follow this character, but as you said, each has a different flavor. I think that's how the best series always go. I mean, you don't want exactly. I mean, some people get away with writing the exact same book over and over again, and it turns out pretty well. I mean, no offense to Robert B. Parker, but the Spencer books were pretty formulaic, and yet they were a delight. Like they're so much fun to read.
Well, and again, the first 10 are wildly different. And again, that's an interesting education in the evolution of a series, because he wrote, I think, 40 of those Spencer books.
Yeah, it's like once a series hits a certain level of maturity, it becomes a little static, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's a hard.
But they're still so entertaining that it's just not the way my brain seems to work.
Right. So what are some of your favorite sort of escape reads? That's another question we've got from Nicholas.
Oh gosh, escape reads. So I often escape into fantasy. I actually think because it's not something, I don't write overt fantasy. Even when I wrote fantasy. It was not, it was very grounded in a recognizable world. So for me, I think of like Susanna Clarke, who I adore. She's very easy to be a completist for because she only has like 2 novels and a short story collection, but she writes such rich fantasy. Her most recent Piranesi, which I'm probably mispronouncing, was just a year or 2 ago, and it's just this marvelous novel that transports you completely outside of your own experience. It takes place entirely in this world that exists. It's like this endless marble structure this person lives inside, and no matter how far you walk, there are always more rooms. And there's jungles and oceans in these rooms. It's marvelous. So I read a lot of fantasy, actually. I read Tim Powers is another favorite author of mine. His shtick is that he likes to look at all of the historical facts about something that happened and try and create a fantastical story that explains that event without contradicting anything. So, for example, one of my favorites is one called Last Call, that sort of recontextualizes Bugsy Siegel and the sort of early days of Las Vegas as a battle for the throne to be the Fisher King of the West. I mean, just bonkers stuff. He has one that's a very Le Carre style thriller called Declare that posits that the Cold War was actually a struggle between East and West to curry favor with a family of jinn that live on Mount Ararat. I mean, just bonkers shit.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So
I haven't read him for a while. I'll go back to him. I think a lot of crime writers really like fantasy and science fiction for some reason. I think it's that some of the tropes are the same, but that it doesn't feel like homework.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. I mean, when you're talking about escapism, it's got to be something I don't feel like I could necessarily do, because otherwise I'm just trying to take it apart to see how it ticks.
Right.
So yeah.
Have you read? This is a spy novel, Damascus Station. Do you like spy stuff?
Oh God, I love spy novels. No, I have not read that, and I'm writing it down as we speak.
It's his first. It's called Damascus Station by David Mccluskey. He's a former CIA analyst. And it's like Le Carre for the modern world.
I'm a huge Le Carre fan.
The villains are fully realized, and they love their kids, and they're horrific people. It's set in this it's in Damascus Station in Syria, and it's beautifully written. I really love this. This is a debut, and it knocked my socks off.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you. By the way, just one little plug, just because I think it's the coolest thing ever. Child Zero recently ended up in a roundup of former intelligence officers, like weekly.
I saw that.
It was like notes of interest, and I was like, man, I either did something very right or very wrong to end up included on this bulletin of former intelligence agents. But yeah, it's crazy.
That's like the guy who wrote the zombie novel ended up as a consultant to the Pentagon.
Yeah, right. It's like, God, if they think I know what I'm talking about, we're in some trouble. I'm an idiot most of the time.
Well, I know this stuff, but well, we're all idiots most of the time. So I think we're running low on time here. I think we're being brought to heel.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have to be the bad guy who ends the events.
Darn you!
A lovely time listening into you guys, though. Thank you guys so much. You guys were a joy to listen to. Thank you to our audience for joining us tonight and all of the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I know in a perfect world we would just keep going on and on. If you guys haven't already, though, you can purchase Child Zero and any of the books kind of discussed towards the end of our event. My lovely bookseller, Kelsey, will be putting those links in the chat. So you guys are welcome to find them there and purchase them if you are interested in any of the books talked about tonight.
And click that blue bar, green bar down at the bottom that says buy this book. Yeah.
And say hi to Moxie one last
And say hi
time.
to Moxie. Come on, Moxie.
Yeah.
Give the people what they
And-
want.
With that, I'm going to sign us out for the evening. Thanks for joining us all, guys, and we'll see you next time.
You
Thank
betcha.
you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Great to see you, Chris. Nice to meet you.